Welcome back. I must tell you, we have a problem with the phone lines. Apparently so many people are calling in that you've jammed the lines. Don't worry, we're hoping to unblock them. Bear with us and keep calling. From now until 12:15, the Clockwork Orange, no, not the film or the book, but the perhaps more sinister reality. This week, the government admitted there was a propaganda operation in Northern Ireland called Clockwork Orange. And we've got with us Colin Wallace, the man who says he was part of it. Clockwork Orange was an intelligence services campaign of lies and smears aimed at hitting the terrorists. Well, Ken Livingstone, I'd like to start with you and ask you, what's wrong with that sort of campaign? After all, terrorist groups like the IRA don't play it exactly clean. They've been bombing and maiming people for the last, 20 years in Northern Ireland?
Of course not. You can't have a war without things going wrong, people stepping over the rules. And no one ever had a nice war. The 2 points that come out of this is, were some of those dirty tricks counterproductive? Did they win more support for the IRA than they actually undermined? And even if we could debate that all night, there's still no way you can justify MI5 officers and army intelligence officers using dirty tricks and black propaganda to smear their own chiefs. We had these people circulating literature suggesting that the then Prime Minister Edward Heath was homosexual. I mean, completely spurious and forged documents, doing similar dirty tricks on the Deputy Leader of the Labour Party, on Harold Wilson. These officers weren't fighting the IRA, they were fighting the elected government of the day, and it was an act of treason.
Let's start with Northern Ireland first, though, because that is the first part, if you like, of this Clockwork Orange campaign, operation. Are you saying that it was justified, then, it was perfectly all right for that sort of campaign to be undertaken by people like Colin Wallace?
No, because I think if you actually talk to people who were the soldiers fighting on the ground, they recognise that when we used the methods of the terrorists, of disinformation or assassination, or sending our troops in civilian clothes over the border to let off bombs, you actually undermined your case. You expect a terrorist organisation to break the law, to kill, to maim innocent people. You do not expect a government supposed to be based on the rule of law to use their methods. As soon as you do that, you've lost. There's no moral difference between the two sides.
Miles Copeland used to be the head of the CIA in Britain. Do you agree with what Ken Livingstone is saying?
Ken is talking nonsense, and I suspect he knows it. Sure. He must remember that at this time, when all these things happened, we were on a kind of war. Now, during World War II, we had people say we mustn't bomb Berlin because we'd be sinking to the level, we'd be just as bad as the Germans. Well, in 1970, we must remember, Ken's not old enough to remember, but at that time, the KGB had doubled its operations. The Soviets had given up on nuclear war. I mean, both sides knew that we're not going to have a nuclear war. We were stalemated in Europe. The Soviets knew, even though they had superior equipment, if they tried to attack us, to attack NATO, they'd wind up finding Czechs and Poles and everyone else. And so they quite wisely descended to, if you like, what they called confrontations of the third kind. Small wars here and there, Africa, Ireland, and wherever. And the Leninist, the neo-Leninist strategy is that the Soviets did not bank on their strengths but on our weaknesses. Now, a principal weakness was Ireland. And as a weakness, we Americans were greatly concerned with, because Irish Americans were helping the cause and whatever. So when we all went into this together, and believe me, the British and the Americans in the intelligence services, rightly or wrongly, believe we have the same enemies. I mean, we have the same problems, same enemies, and so we exchange information, we work together on these things. What happens, however, is that once you have a secret operation where the whole principles of management are different than they are in, say, General Motors or U.S. Steel or whatever, you have compartmentalized need-to-know segments where it's very easy for one little section to use some personal grudge in order to go after someone they didn't like Ted Heath. Now, let me add one more thing. And that is that in all of these operations that we Americans knew about, they were not operations against any particular, certainly no cabinet ministers were involved, but members of the parliament or members of Congress in America. They are the ones who were caught on the side of some operation against a nuclear operation of the Soviets. Now, I forget how many MPs there are, but you must think that the Soviets are awfully dead. How many?
Too many.
Well, okay. But you either think that this KGB is absolutely inactive and not doing anything, or you've got to accept that they've got certain MPs that they have in fact recruited, and we now know that they've recruited.
But the actual smears and lies and all the rest of it, Clockwork Orange, at the first stage, that was okay. That's part and parcel of that sort of war against terrorism. Let me
wait, let me add one more thing.
No, well, very brief.
Well, yeah, I'll make this brief. For one, I was probably the first person in the CIA who got into this dirty tricks business. They weren't as dirty as a lot of people think.
Yeah, because a lot of people find it very objectionable.
But just a minute. To blacken someone's a hell of a lot better than killing him. In World War II, we killed people. And now, when we got into business, well, we were simply playing dirty tricks to prevent having World War III.
Some people might prefer to be dead than smeared so horribly as it appears, according to Ken Livingstone, that they have been. But Colin Wallace, you're the man that sparked all this off now, and you're the man at the centre of it all. What sort of things are we talking about? Because is it just this sort of idea of sitting down with the journalists and sort of wink, wink, nudge, nudge, did you know that, so-and-so might be this, that and the other? What are we talking about?
Oh, I think there's a wide range of activities at the very bottom end of the scale. If the IRA rob a bank and they disappear off with £5,000, you go along to journalists and say they stole £10,000.
And this is what you would do, is it?
That's right, because then the leadership of the IRA would say, where's the other 5,000?
And this, what was this for? Was this to subvert within the IRA, to make them feel uncomfortable
that's right,
as an organisation?
The idea is you've got to destabilise the terrorists, and you've also got to try and make them believe they've got informers in their own ranks, so that you upset their own planning procedures. But again, I think there's a big difference between that type of operation, I would agree with Miles Copeland, as opposed to the attempts to overthrow a democratically elected government, because that's what the IRA are trying to do. And our job as security forces was to beat the terrorists, not actually help them do the job they were trying to do.
So what made you change your mind? Because presumably at the beginning you were very happy to do all this, weren't you?
Well, yes, I grew up in Northern Ireland. I believed that terrorism, either from the right or the left, was the enemy at the time. I did not join the security forces to discredit the Labour Party, the Conservative Party, the Liberal Party. And because I was deflected from my main job into doing political disinformation, I was not actually doing the job I joined to do.
So what sort of political disinformation did you get involved in?
Basically, we were passing round forged documents, including forged CIA identity cards, which didn't actually exist.
Dirty dog.
And these were senior people in Northern Ireland. Was this related to, or on the mainland as well?
No, including Northern Ireland politicians, where we had forged bank accounts. We had election literature from the Labour Party saying that they were very friendly to the North Vietnamese at the time when Kennedy and Nixon was trying to knock the stuffing out of Ho Chi Minh. So in other words, you were trying to show the Labour Party in a bad light.
And the sort of thing that Ken's been talking about, the specific smearing of Wilson, of Ben, of other people, did you know of that? Were you involved in that?
Yes, well, what happened really was that that information was supplied to me from London, but it was designed to be set in the context of a homosexual scandal in Belfast. And at that time, of course, the world's press were covering the Northern Ireland troubles, and this was an ideal platform to disseminate the information too. But I withdrew from the operation in September '74, just before the general election, as part of my dispute over the misuse of intelligence. And that's really how this row all started.
So I know that yesterday, for example, Dale Campbell-Savers, one of Labour's MPs, stood up and said, this has been said, supposedly by a Labour MP, at a conference that actually never took part. Does this ring a bell with you? These are examples that Ken have given. Can you confirm them? Can you say, yes, that's a piece of information which I saw come from MI5 or wherever, and which I gave out?
Yes, the one I can confirm was the one that Merlin Rees had, which listed various politicians attending a Bloody Sunday commemoration service. In fact, what happened was we got an original leaflet, we blanked out some of the names and we inserted the politicians into it. But there were others. There was a forged bank account belonging to Ian Paisley, where he was buying land in Canada and things like that.
Barry Cam, you've known Colin Wallace.
Yes, for a very long time.
To be blunt, can we trust him? I mean, with respect, Colin Wallace, you're the sort of chap that spread lies in the past. Why should we believe him now?
Well, I think there's one important thing to remember in all of this. These documents may have been produced by Colin and others, smearing individuals, smearing organisations. But the important thing to remember is all those documents that Dale Campbell-Savers waived in the House of Commons this week were never published, because any responsible journalist in Northern Ireland in the early 70s knew what Colin Wallace was up to. There was this gung-ho character who was running around at dead of night, shoving envelopes full of documents into the letter boxes of journalists, and Colin would meet you at Army headquarters and say, oh, by the way, do you know that Ian Paisley is mixing with a man who's a known homosexual? And you'd say, there's Colin's at it again. So, in a sense, the black propaganda campaign... Yeah, the black propaganda campaign...
me the popular press wouldn't print that?
Well, all I'm saying to you is, I mean, Colin had some very notable successes. I mean, Colin got into a newspaper in Britain the story of exploding knickers, and that was at about the level at which this black
This
propaganda...
must have been the Sun. This must have been
No,
the Sun.
do you want me to tell you the story?
Well,
It's a useful story to
go on,
understand
go on.
how they
Yes,
did it.
do, because we want
At a
to
certain period of
understand
time in the
this, don't
70s, a number of young women were going into public buildings with explosive devices concealed inside them, would you believe? Colin concocted a story that these devices could be prematurely exploded by static in nylon knickers. Now, what that achieved was a lot of little girls in West Belfast were wetting their knickers for a few weeks, but only one newspaper actually took that story up and published it, and when he published it, he knew it was a lie.
But I think the specific point is...
that in
Yes.
Lurgan, 2 ladies were destroyed by carrying explosives into a public
But it
lavatory in the
wasn't
market
static on the
square.
nylon knickers,
And
was it?
after that story came out, for what it's worth, it didn't occur again in Ireland.
Fred Holroyd, I mean,
That can't be bad.
I think this is another key point, because you were involved in running agents both north and south of the border. The sort of things that we're talking about, were they justified if they stopped innocent people or soldiers being murdered and killed?
Well, I agree with Ken Livingstone that if you're fighting for law and order against terrorism, and you are reduced to using terrorism to fight the terrorists, then what on earth are you fighting for? What on earth are you trying to uphold? If you've become terrorists yourself, they've won. Because you're using exactly the same tricks as them.
It happened to America.
Anthony Beaumont-Dark, is that right?
You must look at the history books. All military history shows that when forces of law and order have resorted to terrorist tactics, in the end they have lost.
That is the issue, isn't it?
Well, there's 2 issues here. First of all, of course, you always get disinformation in any kind of war, as my friend here has just said. But if you take the case of Mr. Wallace here, Tom King and the Prime Minister had no reason to protect anybody because they're not personally implicated. So in the Wallace case, as it's now become, they have all they're concerned with is that the proper facts should be known. This new information was laid before Parliament, not at anybody's request, except at Tom King and the Prime Minister's, so that the truth should be known.
Well, he's been banging on about it for donkey's
Hold
years.
on, indeed he has. Mr. Colcott is sitting on an inquiry into the Wallace case, and I think it should be said that I would rather trust Tom King and the Prime Minister's view of things than as Mr. Wallace has rightly been called gung-ho, which is why in 1975 he could either resign or be sacked, and in 1981 charged with murder, subsequently dropped to manslaughter, for which he got 10 years in jail, and Paul Foot, as ever, backs anybody in the world to try to say that he was framed.
But this
and
is the issue,
all this is a subterfuge, to be absolutely blunt, so that as everybody else who's ever convicted of any crime, poor Mr. Wallace was framed. I don't believe he was framed.
But the point that he made...
Absolute rubbish.
It's a fact, my dear chap.
Yeah, let
I'll tell you
him
some
go.
facts.
Hang on. Let him go back.
Jonathan Lewis was murdered wearing a suit. He normally wore casual clothes. He was a medallion man. That day, he took a suit from the cleaners that had been...
Oh, no,
10 years in jail.
I might say, no, I'm going to stop you there.
I can prove that there is evidence that shows that Colin Wallace
Because
couldn't have committed that
no, just a
murder.
minute, both of you. We're not discussing.
It's very
no, just a minute,
important to
Tony.
the
We are
case.
not. We are not discussing. We're not discussing that. The issue which this gentleman raised and Mr. Wallace raised was whether or not it was right to conduct a campaign with as dirty hands as the people that you're trying to fight. And he says, once you do that, you sink to their level. That's the issue.
It's like we bombing Berlin. When we bombed Berlin, we were sinking to the Germans' level.
That's right. That is the issue. Is it right to do it? Because according to Tom, according to Tom King, it's still going on.
We would have lost the Second World War, as Miles Copeland says, if we hadn't bombed Berlin while they were bombing Birmingham and Coventry.
So it's right. It is right to do the sort of
You
thing.
fight fire with fire quite often.
Right.
Of course you do.
Right.